introduce herself and let her know let you all know about her connection to ARCIS as well. So Diane, welcome.
Great, thanks. And I have a slide where I introduce myself, so I'm going to actually first, if we go to the next slide, start with just a little bit about what I'm going to talk about today. And the first note is that this is not a talk about research that has been completed. This is both my rant about why we need to be looking at these issues and thinking about these issues, and then describing some work that's underway now, though as you can imagine, it's perhaps a little bit delayed from where we'd hoped to be. Makes me very sad right now. Sorry, I'm gonna try to keep up with my notes. So what I'm going to talk about today is work that emerges from a broader research agenda around understanding the role of education and knowledge transfer in supporting the self-determined sustainable development efforts of communities in the Arctic, especially thinking about Indigenous communities. So I'll talk a little bit about current thinking around education and sustainable development, how we might rethink the role or redefine the way we use education as we talk about self-determined sustainable development, including broadening the way we talk about knowledge transfer. And I'm still looking for different words even to use in this, so I'd love some insight from those of you who are active educators and those of you who are looking at education to think about how we describe these things. And then I'll, throughout it and at the end, share a little bit about the research that's happening right now and some of our initial impressions. If we go to the next slide, that's just the about me. I am a professor at the Institute of Social and Economic Research at UAA, and was the founding director of the Center for Alaska Education Policy Research within UAA. So those of you who've looked at education research issues in Alaska may have seen some of our work around teacher supply and demand, or have done research on the boarding school experiences of Indigenous folk in Alaska before the Molly Hooch case. And as I have worked at ICER, I have become more and more engaged in work around circumpolar or Arctic education issues. And this has led to me getting involved in a number of organizations. I'm a board member for ARCIS, and I guess I'm in my second year of that right now. And then I'm also, I also sit on the International Arctic Social Sciences Association Council, which is a neat organization that comes together every 3 years for the International Congress of Arctic Social Sciences. And we are one of the recognized participants or observer organizations for the Arctic Council. So we're involved in some of the circumpolar policy-making conversations as well as the research conversations. And at UAA, I serve a role with the Chancellor under the Chancellor, trying to coordinate the Arctic research endeavor, just trying to really help actually get the word out about what we're doing, and also think actively about the educational activities we engage in. And in partnership with ARCIS, we've done an Anchorage Arctic Research Day, sadly, again, postponed, but a way to bring together people across sectors, because yes, I'm an academic, and at times I don't know what my colleagues in federal or state or tribal entities are doing, and we need to have that conversation to better do our work. So that's one of the things we've been trying to do here in Anchorage. And I'm this picture is quite a number of years old. We used to have an initiative called the Alaska Partnership for Teacher Enhancement and the Alaska Educational Innovations Network in Alaska. And through those, I had the great fortune of spending some time in a number of rural communities and meeting my husband, who is also a PolarTREC veteran, out in one of these communities. And so there's some pictures in here peppered from some of those adventures as well as more recent ones. So next
Uh,
slide, please. Oh,
that was
yeah.
one question was which community was this particular one?
So this is Tulaksak, and all of these kids should be in college now, or yeah, at least. But yes, this was a number of years ago in Tulaksak. And I spent 2 summers in Akiachek with my husband, which was, well, he was out there one summer. That's when we met, and all appropriate. But it was when those, walks in a village that are very romantic. All right. So why should we be rethinking the role of education and sustainable development? And I'm sorry, I just lost to make sure. Yes, we're on the same page. So this work is emerging from two different places. One is my frustration that education tends to be overlooked in discussions about sustainable development generally. And the other is the ways that education and knowledge transfer are defined and discussed, which tend to be very narrow, particularly amongst the natural science research community. My thinking was shaped in part by time that I've been spending with colleagues from Canada and Alaska on a project to develop renewable energy projects and energy stability across rural and remote northern communities. And for that, as we were writing the funding proposal, I was looking at available models for asset mapping where communities identify their assets and their readiness to engage in different kinds of projects. And when I looked at asset mapping specific to energy projects, most of them focused on infrastructure, and they didn't focus at all on the people needed to operate and maintain energy systems once those are developed. And also, as would not surprise anybody, these approaches to asset mapping are very Western, with assumptions that the creators of the asset mapping know exactly what the communities need. Also, during one of our planning gatherings, I heard a lot of local indigenous leaders. And so this project is involving Métis and Cree and Gwich'in folk across the northwest of Canada. And they talked about how you get well-meaning outsiders like me coming in to tell them what kind of renewable energy projects they need without asking local community members what they think they need. And so in some places, they're being told they need wind towers or they need solar, when what the community really wants is simply more energy efficient buildings. My thinking also was shaped by stories I've heard repeatedly in Alaska around systems being built and whether these are renewable energy systems or just diesel generators. The system fails because there's only one person in the community trained to run the system, and that person didn't keep the system operating. And that might be because that person got ill, or they fell in love and moved to another community, or so on. But it means that across Alaska, there have been stories about systems breaking down. And really this concern that the communities don't feel ownership of these systems. So there's no redundancy in the people with the capacity to maintain them. And I was also in one community where they were building a new school, and there was a dispute over who should get connected to the water and power systems that were going to be made available on a limited basis attached to the school. And this dispute created such a long delay that in the winter, the generator froze and broke. And that coincided with one of the big hurricanes down in the Gulf. And so they couldn't get the needed transformers and other parts back up to Alaska to fix that. So the opening of a brand new school building was delayed by a number of months. So the work we're currently doing, which I'll talk about in a bit, we also heard about a well-meaning person coming into one of the villages that has no running water and decided that the houses needed large water heaters and bathtubs and a pipe system to supply water to all the houses. And they did this without talking first to the community leaders. So needless to say, they also told me about the pile of junked water heaters and bathtubs that are in the dump and rusting water pipes that are buried nearby. So I don't separate education and knowledge or education issues for self-determination from that issue, larger issue of community self-determination. And that's why we have this title. Next slide, please. So sustainable development in the Arctic is hot right now. Sorry about that. But there's been so many books and reports released on this topic in the past few years. And you know, here's just some of the covers of those. We've got this conversation happening in Alaska and in the European Union, and the Arctic Council has a sustainable development working group. But where are the education researchers in this conversation? So a group that I work with, which has a very long title, the Thematic Network, University of the Arctic Thematic Network on Teacher Education for Social Justice and Diversity, has a book that we just released on inclusion and equity in education. But that's really an education research project, and again, not part of this larger discussion on the meaning of sustainable development. So I'm trying to find out who's critically exploring what does it mean to engage in developing the knowledge and skills that are needed so that communities can achieve their own self-determined goals. Next slide. So education is mentioned in a number of conversations about sustainable development, but I would argue it's not being looked at in the way it should be in order to help northern communities, and all communities really, achieve their goals. So the United Nations has their sustainable development goals, and goal number 4 is around quality education, and they call education the key that will allow many other sustainable development goals to be achieved. But they focus only on formal schooling attainment. That's an important goal, but that's not something that necessarily supports sustainable development across the Arctic. Indeed, I'm part of a project called Arctic Youth and Sustainable Futures, and this is funded by the Nordic Council of Ministers and led by some colleagues in Iceland. And we've been doing focus groups in all of the Arctic nations. And the young people tell us that formal schooling is quite disconnected from the skills they need and their aspirations. In fact, one college student from rural Alaska told us that it's really hard taking college classes that she's never going to use. And she says, what's the point? But everybody says that you have to do it. And she'd rather use her time learning to make baskets or traditional skills or to do language revitalization. But she's taken this attitude, you just have to step back and get it done. Next slide. But to keep picking on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, they have this target for 7, which is education for sustainable development and global citizenship. And I'm a big fan of global citizenship. My undergraduate, one of my degrees was peace and conflict studies. But that's a very different set of goals from sustainable development on the ground in our communities. And so they're talking about learners acquiring knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development through education for sustainable development, which is a very circular argument. And then they go into human rights, gender equality, promoting peace and nonviolence. Again, important things, but missing the point of what does it mean for communities to be sustainable. Next slide, please. So, and if we look at how the UN measures education for sustainable development, it narrows learning to environmental science and geoscience. So as an indicator for 15-year-olds. And again, environmental science is critical, but that is not going to help a village in the Northwest Territory of Canada figure out how they're going to keep everybody housed and fed and having meaningful opportunities to grow and develop, perhaps with commerce. So next slide. And then if we try to understand whether this vague education for sustainable development is included across the formal schooling system, what does that mean if we don't even have a definition that is actionable as communities see this needed. So, I look at the indicators on this and say that they're not connected to any concrete definition of sustainable development for communities. And I don't understand how these indicators measure ways that education will move communities towards sustainable development. So important targets, but not linked with certainly what's being discussed across the North. Next slide. And so we tend to see very narrow definitions, again, of education in Arctic research efforts. This is coming from a definition here from the European Union. And I will say I was just asked to contribute to the next polar research agenda document for the EU. And I'm hoping that maybe I've shifted things a little bit because they have taken some of the language I proposed. Because they're looking at as Arctic research as a vehicle to strengthen science education curriculum. And again, that's part of what we're trying to do, but that doesn't move a community all the way to where they need to be in terms of knowledge. Next slide, please. Now, I'll say our Arctic education community does have a better sense of the centrality of education in these efforts, and I might have contributed to some of this wording in 2018, where the University of the Arctic Congress, which includes representatives from, you can see how many people are on the stage there. There's probably over 180 institutions that are part of the University of the Arctic. And we said education is an essential element in building a sustainable future for Northerners, strengthening their ability to determine their own futures. So this is getting away from curriculum content and much more into what are the goals of education more broadly, and developing new knowledge that benefits the North and the world. So it's an active conception of how education can create sustainability, but it doesn't necessarily get us to our understanding of what it looks like. And again, I find many Arctic researchers seeing education as a way to disseminate their findings about Arctic sustainable development rather than as the means for building the capacity of individuals and communities to respond to the dramatic changes they're facing. So this is why I keep saying repeatedly, we have to reframe the role of education as a tool for sustainable development, because it allows us to build the knowledge needed for resilience and adaptation amongst humans in the Arctic. But again, we got to figure out what that means. So next slide, please. There are many definitions of sustainable development that are being used across the Arctic. And one that you see consistently referred to, I think this is sort of a foundational document, is from the Brundtland Commission, where they say sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And then I've been part of a international research collaboration network around sustainable development, headed by Andrei Petrov, who's based at University of Northern Iowa, originally from St. Petersburg, and Jessica Graybill, who's at Colgate University. And the network came up with this definition about sustainable Arctic development as development that improves the health and well-being of Arctic communities and residents while conserving ecosystem structures, functions, and resources. So starting to get more specific about what does it mean to meet the needs of the present. Next slide, please. And then we have a list of goals, which really do try to get quite specific about what's the goal of sustainable development. So you see we've got sustainable economies, cultures, communities, and environments. And within that, there's a lot of very specific tasks you're trying to get to. So prosperity, jobs, economic diversification, access to capital, which is important even in our tiniest communities if they're going to manage to survive in a world where being part of the cash economy needs to at least be some of what they do, because subsistence activities, at least for now, still require fossil fuels and other materials, boats, guns, and things that are not necessarily made locally. Sustainable cultures, of course, that's a big piece in terms of thinking about education and knowledge transfer, whether it's done in formal institutions or done in the community. So if you begin to work from these goals, it becomes quite clear that we need to think about human capital, developing humans' abilities to engage in these activities, and knowledge transfer. You can't have a vibrant economy, certainly, without an educated workforce. But again, this is often left out of the discussion in Arctic research circles. Sustainable cultures definitely rely on knowledge transfer, and then this is where we have to really recognize that there are knowledge sharing systems that are not based on formal education. And again, I'm looking for good language to use as we talk about this. And obviously we need educated citizenry who can create food security systems, understand how best to define and enact sustainable practices in terms of ecosystems. And this is not necessarily book knowledge, nor is the role of education discussed when scientists go out to work with communities to try to do this work. So yes, scientists go and talk to students about what they are doing, but how do you have a successful community-based observation system if you don't have people who actually have the knowledge on how to engage in this work? Next slide, please. So this is where I'm really, positing this as these are the questions we need to be answering in terms of the role of education for self-determined sustainable development. The first is, what is the role of education, both formal and informal or non-institutional or community-based, in expanding the capacity of Arctic residents to respond to the challenges of rapid social, economic, cultural, environmental, and climate change? Next slide, please. What human capacity development is needed to enable Arctic residents to develop, implement, and operate governance structures that move their communities toward greater self-determination? Next slide, please. And in what ways can education contribute to transforming the health, social services, and economic systems of the North and move them toward less dependence on outside governments and economies? And I will say that as we all sit in our respective shelter-in-place locations, this last question has become incredibly important, because we have a lot of places that are struggling with how do we keep people out so that we don't transmit a virus that the community may not have the resources to combat, while still keeping critical resources coming in that we need, because communities are interconnected and not fully self-sufficient. And maybe this is where we need to be thinking about how do we get to less dependence on those supply chains or change the way that they function. Next slide, please. So resilient communities need residents with many different areas of expertise to address the many challenges that they face. This includes a mix of local, indigenous, and Western scientific knowledge. Communities also need to be able to figure out what knowledge is needed depending on what they want to do. Are they interested in a new water treatment system, or developing a way to process sheep or reindeer for commercial sale? Or maybe they want to fight an outside interest that's trying to develop a mine nearby, or get more of their own residents to become teachers for their own schools. Communities' ability to achieve collective goals is directly related to their human capacity, but we don't tend to start from that perspective when we discuss resilience, well-being, and sustainable development. And moreover, communities need to be able to identify who has which knowledge, skills, figure out where the gaps are, and decide how to fill them. Is this by sending someone to college? Is this by hiring a consultant? Is it by identifying an elder from another community who can share their knowledge that's needed? So there is a lot of focus right now in the scientific, especially the Arctic science world, on co-production of knowledge with indigenous peoples and with local communities. But after that knowledge is developed, how is it being transferred? That seems to get forgotten, as though the new knowledge is going to share itself. So sure, we as academics disseminate and publish, and there's recognition that we need to share knowledge back to communities with whom we collaborated. But how do we make sure that they have the tools to share that knowledge and to act on that knowledge? Next slide, please. So we really need to be thinking about knowledge and human capital, not just as that which is transmitted through formal schooling institutions, but also something that's happening through family and community-based knowledge sharing systems. First, we know that there's much knowledge that simply is not included in Western educational institutions. Local and indigenous knowledge is often not included even when the knowledge bearers offer it. And these were stories that when I first came to Alaska and spent some time with educators who had taught in rural communities and then were in more urban communities, they would tell the stories of the elders coming in and saying, "It's our day in the school." And these were educators who said, "Great, it's your day in the school." And they'd turn over the classroom to those kids. But in this urban community, elders would come in and teachers would say, "It's not a good day for you to be here." So, and I know teachers have enormous constraints placed on them depending on your curriculum package and, more importantly, your administrator. But so what does it mean to include indigenous knowledge when it is offered? It is also, of course, that some of the knowledge is not to be shared outside of communities. It doesn't make it any less important to recognize, but that also is a conversation that needs to be had. We need to also understand, of course, what the formal schooling system fails to do. So there's strong evidence that formal education systems are not meeting the needs of many Northern and Indigenous students. This is evidence not only in the data that we usually use, in terms of assessing school success, so graduation rates, dropout rates, post-secondary attendance and completion, but in other ways of assessing the effectiveness of schooling. So in terms of the former, there are significant gaps in achievement and school completion rates between students living in northern and remote regions of Arctic nations and those in southern and more urban areas, as well as between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. And there are many reasons for this, including high teacher turnover, curriculum and pedagogical methods that are not culturally relevant, and educators in some of our communities who don't have high expectations for students. However, there are also problems with the disconnect between school systems designed by people from outside in very different contexts and the northern communities onto which these systems were imposed. So in focus groups that we were talking about that I was talking about earlier with the young people, we do definitely hear of the divide that between the youth goals and aspirations for themselves and for their communities and what they're learning. Young people who want to be entrepreneurs, who want to create businesses in their hometowns are not receiving training to do that. And young people who are receiving college degrees are not finding jobs at home that match their skill sets. And with the energy projects, again, that issue of a lack of robust number of skilled workers to maintain those energy systems. So we really need to rethink how we're doing education in the North, what's the structure and the purpose, and then tie it directly to community goals. But there is a question about how we do this. Next slide, please. All right. And so the other issue as we think about formal schooling is that there is this double-edged sword. So we do see this issue about educational attainment being connected to outmigration, particularly for women. We see, you know, if you look at research from developing nations, there's a direct link between increasing literacy and educational attainment, particularly for women, and health outcomes and economic well-being. There's actually some evidence, I believe it was in India, where creating literacy without seeing any increase in the earnings of these women still changed the health outcomes for their children. But for some reason in the North, we see that issue of young men not attaining, having the same educational attainment outcomes as young women, and young women leaving as opposed to staying and transforming the communities. So now, this gets to what we're trying to do with my current project and some of the broader efforts that we've been involved in, which is thinking about who determines what needs to be taught and learned and why. And that's the broader contextual issue. How do we change the role of the formal education system to really meet the needs as defined by the community, not as defined by curriculum developers from, if you think about it, Texas, New York, and California, where we have the largest number of curricular packages being created? And how do we co-construct knowledge transfer systems in the way that we think about co-constructing knowledge itself? So the specific project I'm working on is with Dr. Charlene Stern up at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And she's an amazing collaborator. First of all, not only is she the PhD level head of or co-chair of Alaska Native Studies and Rural Development, but she's also a Indigenous leader. She's the vice president of Tanana Chiefs Conference. She grew up in Arctic Village, which is where some of these beautiful pictures come from, and enrolled member of the Venati tribe. And so brings that inside outside perspectives. Not she is the definition of co-constructed knowledge, I guess. And so we're trying to understand how a community can develop its own theory of action for their self-determined sustainable development goals, and then identify the knowledge that is needed in their community, the knowledge that they hold in their community, and how you fill the gaps. And this is something we're not sure what we're doing, and we're doing co-constructing it with the community, because the idea is, if we can do this well with this community, perhaps we can create a process, perhaps we can create materials that other communities can take and adapt and do this themselves. Or maybe it is easier to have a couple of us come in from outside and workshop this with communities. I think all of us have had the experience of struggling with something, and when an outside perspective or outside guidance comes in and helps us. But we'd really like a process that communities can engage in themselves and make that decision themselves. So we are working with Venati and Arctic Village, the communities that Charlene is from. And this is where we, of course, like everybody else, have come to a screeching halt. We've had our initial consultation with the tribal council and community leaders. We've talked about this process and our questions. They have bought in fully. And our next step was to head out to the community and work with a broader group of people on their vision for self-determined sustainable development, and documenting this theory of change and doing this work around skills and knowledge. So our hope is, if things, depending on the timeline for the flattening of the curve and resumption of interpersonal interactions, maybe early in the fall. But in our initial visit with the tribal council, we did hear some more of those same kinds of stories about local knowledge that external people did not realize that was held, or actually did work with them on. So in one case, there was an outside group of researchers, engineers who wanted to come in and talk about how to build usable roads in that in one of the villages. And the elders looked at them and said, we don't use roads, we use trails, and we need to know how to maintain trails ourselves. And so they collaboratively worked on developing trails and developing a trail maintenance project together. And that's the example of how it should work, with the offering of skills from the researchers that the community can identify where the knowledge transfer needs to happen, what needs to happen, and how this supports their own vision of self-determined sustainable development. And the opposite was, of course, the story I talked about with the water pipes and the bathtubs and the water heaters. But there are people in that community who can identify, for example, when somebody talks about wanting to put into place a better energy system and or some kind of a water system, that they need to rethink how they develop their community structurally, how they site new houses. I mean, it's one of the local community members saying, we can't just build willy-nilly wherever we want. If we actually want to do these things, we need to grid this community out and plan where we're going to build new houses. And they also are really interested in developing better access to the Yukon River, because right now there is no usable tributary. Apparently you can take a very exciting whitewater ride down from Venati to the Yukon, but you can't actually move freight up that. And so they are stuck with spending huge amounts of money to fly in a large plane every once in a while if they want to bring in large equipment to use in the community or large infrastructure, such as big water tanks or fuel holding tanks. And so they want to figure out, can we basically build a canal that works? Well, that's going to require a huge amount of diverse knowledge, because you've got land rights issues, so you need a lawyer. You've got how the river works when it's frozen and when it's flowing. That probably takes an elder who has been working with that river all her or his life. You've got knowledge of the commerce needs in that community and the commerce possibilities. So that may be an internal or external economic development expert, and so on. So we're trying to figure out how we move that forward. Next slide. So this is really about recognizing knowledge bearers and knowledge needed. One of the things these communities are not used to is somebody who looks like me walking in and saying, what is the knowledge that you have? And that's really problematic. We all need to be recognizing the phenomenal knowledge that exists in our local communities, and the ability of that knowledge to drive research that is better, because it is grounded in the combination of that knowledge and the Western knowledge that we can bring from outside institutions. And so that is our goal from this project, and hopefully we can get back together again in December, and I can tell you what we've learned and what our next steps are going to be. And I think I'm going to stop speaking at that point and see if there are questions or comments. Next slide.
There was lots going on in the chat area.
Good. And the last slide has my email on it. So, because I'm hoping people also want to continue this after.
Okay, so I'm going to kind of back up a little bit, and I think this was Jillian's question. So I'm going to go through all the ones I saw come through chat, and then we'll open it up, or if people want to jump in and clarify what they wrote. How do we change the ideology for organizations that offer grants to see the real need within sustainable communities? My reference point would be the Navajo families here in Arizona.
That is a great point. So we've just put in a proposal, and it's ARCIS and all of these different international networks. So International Arctic Social Sciences Association, International Arctic Science Committee, and so forth. to, if we get this funding, to try to change how we create interdisciplinary research projects that are guided by communities. But one of the pieces that I wrote into it very specifically is trying to bring funders out to observe this process, because I have seen funding. I know of one in particular funding agency, the Moore Foundation, that gave money to researchers at Columbia University to go out to Kotzebue in the Northwest Arctic and spend 3 days meeting with local community leaders and elders to talk about what it's the process I'm describing. I wish I could say I was brilliant and made this up, but they had already done this. The community members looking at the technology that these guys from Columbia have and saying, what are the questions you have that we might be able to help you with? And it was questions using drones and other remote sensing on, we can see leads opening up basically at the wrong time of year now, thanks to climate change, and what's happening when walruses or seals are moving up those leads, what's going on beyond our reach because it's not safe to go with any kind of transport vehicles that we have, or other things like that. And so you've got right there a funder who says the important thing is establishing the relationship and letting the community determine the research that the scientists can then contribute to. So I'm hoping we can see more examples of modeling that. There's and I'll get these resources to Judy and Janet to share with you. There's a couple of folk down in I want to say Arizona, who are indigenous scholars who have tried to reconceptualize what does it mean to do genuine co-production of research. And then there's, of course, work that ARCIS folk are also involved in, the work that Carolina Behe and team have worked on here. So there's a couple of nice publications. And the issue is, can we get funders to look at that and say, we need to support that beginning conversation? That so my hope is, if we get our funding, I do have some connections to some of the biggies. I've been funded by Ford Foundation, and my doctoral advisor is no longer there, but she was a program officer. My undergraduate thesis advisor is a program officer for another big foundation, and I'm hoping I can reach them and say, why don't you come out and see how this works? And maybe even our very own, we have a local foundation called the Rasmussen Foundation that does a funders visit every year. And these funders are coming up and they're getting this tour of Alaska and they're saying, oh yes, we should be involved, but not to diss Rasmussen too much, I doubt there's a local community component in any of this conversation. So maybe we can invite them to come as well. Because until we get the funders into the community and give the power to the community to share what they need with those funders, it's not going to happen.
Just a side note, on a workshop I conducted with Marilyn Sigmund last May, the North Pacific Research Board, which again is a local Alaska funder research entity, they have started to change their language in their funding requests to not just about indigenous groups, but basically to start including community members in the planning and the research. And that also, if you're doing community research, that you need to have those people from the get-go invested in your plan and helping you design their plan. It's kind of same with evaluation. If you're doing education outreach, you need to have evaluators help you draft those things. So some of the funders are starting to recognize that it's not just a researcher, but you have to have these other entities involved at the very beginning to have those, whether you're community, whether you're evaluation, whether you're in education, whoever it is that needs to be there. So,
and I think we are really, I mean, we're seeing NSF take steps, definitely strong steps in that direction. Not perfect. This is not going to be an easy process, but I think we're at a good point where this conversation is being recognized as being important.
Yeah. Okay, so another question came up. Again, I think this is from Jillian, and there's two parts to this. One is, and Cara. So they heard you talk about strategies. What are the strategies to include Indigenous knowledge when educators are so wrapped up by state and national standards? They love examples. And then Cara wants to know, was Indigenous history included in Alaska education standards?
So I'll start with the easy question, the second one, which is the answer, sort of. We have an Alaska Studies course that on paper looks like it's including that, and in practice, the implementation is very spotty. And part of it is the resources were made available for people to go and create their own course. Well, you know how much time people have to go and create their own course. And what ended up happening, at least in Anchorage, was a lot of teachers went immediately to the worksheets rather than to the more engaging source documents, simply because who's got time to create your own course when the other trick with Alaska Studies is it seems to be the last hired gets to be the people who get to teach it. I mean, it's a shame because there are great materials that look super fun, and the support and curriculum development has been next to nothing. Part of that is also that even when the state of Alaska was flush a few years ago, there has been this systematic cutting of curriculum support people at the state level. So there is no social studies curriculum support person formally hired by the state. There are two vacancies. One is for a math person and one is for a language arts person, and that's your curricular support, really. It falls onto the shoulders of districts. Well, if you're an Anchorage school district, you've got a large infrastructure and some good curricular support and coordination. And if you are UP at school district, the same person who's doing special ed and filling out federal reports is also doing curriculum support. So there's virtually nothing. In terms of strategies, this really is, this is where, one, we need time for professional development that we keep taking away, or we keep narrowing to professional development on compliance with federal regs. But when we had those grants I talked about before, the Alaska Partnership for Teacher Enhancement, the reason we were in these rural communities was to give teachers paid, hands-on experience in developing place-based materials, hearing from elders that were also standards-based. So trying to say, you can get to standards using place-based materials. But again, it needs support. You need professional development. It really helps to have some materials that have been developed. North Slope Borough School District has the Inupiaq Learning Framework, and they have a curriculum development initiative, which included involvement by Jay McTighe. Some of you may recognize that name. He's one of the backward design people, and he was up there helping people think about how do you lay out, again, content standards and create curriculum material that's grounded in and collaborative with a community member that can then be accessed by other people. It's really hard work. They were sort of successful. They were really struggling with, can you ask teachers who already have a more than full-time job to then add this curriculum development on top? And that's what they were trying to do, and they backed off on some of that. So, I guess the obvious answer is we need to invest resources. We need to invest resources in making materials available in a coherent fashion. And then we need professional development that includes engaging, if you are in a place with a local Indigenous community, how do we actually make that engagement productive so that elders and community members can contribute to teachers' lessons and or perhaps be the instructor of record for some of those pieces with compensation for them. And then the second is really to give people some time to do that development themselves. Because, I always think about the principal who told me, no one in this community cares about school, they care about whaling. And I looked at him and I said, well, build your curriculum on whaling. Because if you're a language arts person, you could have kids go out and interview elders and write stories about traditional whaling stories and then compare it to Moby Dick. You can have biology teachers working on the nutritional content of blubber, as well as, of course, the lifespan of a whale. You can have physics teachers working on why does it work to get a whole bunch of people on a rope and pulley system to pull a 20-ton whale onto the land. There's so many things that can be done, but you need some time and you need some support. And that support needs to be respectful, as in paid summer curriculum development time and paid professional development.
Sorry, we were having a little chat too while you were talking about it. Both Katie Gavinas, who lives down in Homer area, and myself are pointing out, North Slope, and she was pointing out South Central, Chugumut Native Corporation, that have done some nice things.
Yeah.
And about the time you said getting locals invested and being educators, I was like, yeah, local educators need to be certified. That would be helpful.
Well, and that's, that on that end, we're talking about tribal schools. What about tribal certification of educators? Where, we have that weird type, what's the type? It's not type C. Is it type C? It's the people who teach indigenous languages or other content that's not formally recognized in other ways. But that's still, it's a pain in the you-know-what. So why not a community-owned process for some of that knowledge?
Right. Okay, another question that came up was, how do you facilitate sharing and honor knowledge of community members, or in my experience, youth, while also maintaining some semblance of credibility? Is that important? I've encountered situations where I tried to ask some of these questions and get confused looks and statements like, hey, I thought you were supposed to be the science teacher and know this stuff.
Right. That's a really good question. I think it is. It's related to my struggle with language. How do we talk about that there are multiple knowledge systems that are equally of value, but no one person necessarily is going to be an expert in all of these. So how do we it's bring them together to expand the understanding of the knowledge that's important. And so, yes, I, as a trained physicist, might be able to explain the trajectory of ocean waves, but I, as a physicist, am not going to be able to explain what that means when elders see kinds of waves, and it means that we're going to see an explosion of some kind of fish, because that's usually when the herrings show up or something. I don't know if that's a good example. Somebody from Sitka might hit me, but that is, it's those kinds of things where you bring together these knowledge systems with, and it's getting people in communities who've been for so long told that their knowledge isn't as important. I mean, that's my friend in Greenland who ran a project on decolonizing the education system there, talked about Greenlandic educators who were all raised in a Danish system, even though they were Greenlanders speaking in the Greenlandic language. And this point where everybody kind of breaks down in tears when they finally realize their own knowledge is of value, the knowledge that was passed down to them. It's just a different knowledge system, but it is of value, and that we need to draw on that as much as we draw on the book knowledge that comes in from Denmark, from Copenhagen or from DC.
Okay, so I'm going to go and have everybody that's still on. We got about 5 more minutes.
Yeah.
Did anybody want to jump in with their question? Just unmute your microphone. We've been busy texting away, so they're
Yeah.
not sure how to use those. Go ahead, Katie.
I'll ask one if no one else has a question. Okay. Diane, I was curious about if you have any experience with kind of the cultural standards that Alaska has set for schools and students and teachers, and if you could discuss a little bit maybe some of the ways that that works well and where there are some problems with that approach, or I've
Yeah.
just heard them held up as fantastic and also as sort of terrible. So I'm curious what it is.
But I'd say, so we are working with those, well, we started working with those cultural standards because I'm working on those cultural standards are written from a sort of kindergarten to high school perspective. And we've got an early childhood project where we were trying to think about how to use them or transform them for early learning settings. And what we really came to was two things. One, they didn't work for that. But in particular, they are really aspirational, but this is something specifically of the guidelines for teachers, because there's a whole bunch about how the community should be involved and so forth. But the rubrics, there's two issues with the rubrics. One is maybe you want to talk about progressing toward the highest level, but you don't necessarily, we're trying not to use these as a assessment of teaching practice, but rather as a tool for self-reflection for educators. And I think that's one thing that would be a useful way. And the other is some of the people who were involved in the standards creation felt that they were obligated to create these very Western linear ways of talking about progressing to expertise. And it's like, no. This is about guidelines for thinking about how do you interact with the knowledge, how do you acquire the knowledge. And so the early learning rubric standards that my colleague Hattie Harvey, for those who are in Alaska, has developed, and well, our dissemination and testing is on hold, as you can imagine, but we'll be there soon. Really talks about, first, it's about the educator having the opportunity to learn this knowledge. Because why are we going to even assess you on it if you even haven't had a chance because you've come from Minneapolis to Shishmaref? Then the second piece is about what is your facility in working with the community and engaging them and trying to guide you through that. And then the third is, how is your practice transformed using this? And so it becomes a way for you as a reflective practitioner to transform your practice as you get to know these communities within which you are working, rather than as a way for me as an outside assessor to sit and evaluate you.
Thank you.
All right, nice question. I have a quick question for you, Diane, before we sign off here. So we talked a lot about Alaska. Is there another country that's doing it right? And if so, who is it?
Yeah, well, I don't know that there's another country. In fact, this is one of my big questions. So in terms of doing it right in a very Western paradigm, I got to spend a little time in schools and with educators in Finland, and oh my gosh, it's dreamy. But my question in Finland is, so what's happening for Sami youth? And I know Sami youth in Northern Norway are actually in a separate system where they're still being taught in their language and schools that are run by those folk. And I think one of the questions that I don't think there's a good answer for is, it's one thing if we say tribally run play or community run schools in Northern Norway, where everybody is speaking the same dialect, the Sami language, but what does it mean to do this well in Anchorage or Los Angeles? Because Los Angeles has even more tribes and more indigenous people than we do in Anchorage. But you know, with all the different linguistic and cultural groups, indigenous and indigenous to other countries. So I don't know that there's an example. I think there's some models, I look at for a tribal or community run school. I always go to Ayaprin Elit Narvik in Bethel, the Yupik Immersion School, which is so grounded in the whole way of living as a Yupik person, but also in really high expectations for those kids. And of course, they suck on an English only language test in 3rd grade. But those kids, when they get to high school, are the valedictorians, the salutatorians, and very and very high achieving. And it's the same frustration, frankly, with any immersion program. We know that that's the best way to go when kids are bilingual and trilingual from when they're little, and quit testing them. There's where Finland gets it right. Those kids are learning the Finnish language, the English language, in some cases the Swedish language, or something else, and they're not given a standardized test run by the state until they're 16, because, hey, imagine that. Teachers know how to assess kids' learning and adjust if they need more support or more challenges.
Very good. All right. Well, I put your, oh, go ahead.
I was to say Jillian was waving her hand, but you're okay. Muted.
Okay, sorry. So then I guess what work is being done at a national level? Because I live here in Arizona. I teach Navajo, Hopi, and Hispanic students in all my classes. And I have students gone, especially girls, for a long period of time based on traditional ceremonies. Why aren't we looking at national change to incorporate traditional, I mean, I teach science, the weaving, the stuff that we could do is amazing, but I'm tied into this ball of standards and stuff.
Yep.
And so how do we make this change at this level and bring it down?
And that's a really good question to which I don't have a good answer, other than that we have to try to start bringing in our policy people. We're lucky enough to have Senator Murkowski on the Education Committee, and she's open to hearing these conversations. She's very informed. She's got a wonderful staff person who does education work. And the question is, can we find some other real allies in those national and federal? And right now, under this current system, we're not going to, I hate to say it, but the Department of Education is not going to shift. So we're going to have to be identifying probably state level advocates, and then moving it to a national conversation when we have a different regime, or at least a different person in the Department of Education at the head.
Okay. Anybody else? Last few questions before we wrap up. All right, good discussion. I did put Diane's contact information earlier in the chat. And like I said, we are archiving this, so we'll share it with you. And Diane, any last words of advice, thoughts that we should take home with us today?
I don't think so, but what I will do is I'm going to send a few resources if you're interested in all your spare time. But we have that group I was talking about, that thematic network. We have a book that's free for download that gives you an overview of what's happening across all of our Arctic countries from very different perspectives. Some are much more about this kind of decolonizing or looking at those structural and political issues in terms of equity and inclusion. Others are much more traditional, special education, inclusion, and equity focused. And a couple of them are completely different, including our Russian colleagues. And we're working on a follow-up now that will be more thematic and hopefully some cross-national, but I'll a couple resources that might be fun. Those chapters are short, so this is not these are pretty easy to get through, and as I said, all free of charge to download.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, and we'll share those out with everybody else as well, so that joined today. All right, well, thank you everybody for joining, and Diane, it was great to see you, and thanks for doing this. A reminder to our audience, we do have another webinar coming up on Thursday to talk about, it's with Jeremy May, who does work out of Tulik Field Station and up on the North Slope. So it's another type of science content, ecology. Awesome. Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. And thanks again, Diane.